Well, greetings, friends. We are so thankful that you are joining us today for this recording of our virtual conversation series called Lead Well through the Center for Theological Leadership. My name is Jeff Stark, and I'm the director for the Center for Theological Leadership, associate professor of Christian ministry at Olivet Nazarene University, and a city missionary to the city of Chicago, where I reside. This is our fourth of 5 virtual conversations in this spring semester, and we've been so thankful for your participation in these conversations over the course of the last few months. Month number 1, we had a conversation with John Ferguson, who's a pastor of a multi-site church throughout the Chicagoland area, talking about how we can effectively reach and engage and bless our neighbors in meaningful ways. And then in February, we had a conversation with Dr. Esau McCulley about his book, Reading While Black, in which he invited us to consider our social location in regards to biblical interpretation. And what a gift that conversation was for us. Last month, we had a conversation with Todd Bolsinger, who recently wrote the book Tempered Resilience, a conversation about adaptive leadership and resiliency. And it was a great conversation about what it means to step into this new world that we are living in, and to be a part of this new world of ministry in which we're constantly having to change the ways we think, the paradigms that we've practiced in the past, and the kinds of leadership posture and ethos that is necessary for us to do that well. And so what a gift that conversation was as well. And today we've got Dr. Deirdre Latz, who's going to be speaking, and I'll introduce her more in just a moment. But I do want to remind you, as you're watching, in May, we will have a combined conversation with Tara Beth Leach on her new book, Radiant Church, and then also Scott McKnight, who has just recently written the book, Tove. And they're going to talk to us about the church in this world that we live in, and some of the unique opportunities and challenges that the church has faced in these recent years. And so we're looking forward to that conversation in May as well. Now, all of this happens in partnership with the School of Theology and Christian Ministry at Olivet Nazarene University. But the Center for Theological Leadership has a unique mission, and that mission is to equip, inspire, and empower theologically informed practitioners to engage the mission of God through events, residencies, collaborative learning environments, and innovative experiential opportunities. Short of it, we just simply want to be a servant to those who faithfully serve the church. This conversation is one in which I've been looking forward to as someone who finds himself situated in the city of Chicago, a major urban environment. I've consistently had this passion for a conversation surrounding the gospel in post-Christendom and in secularizing environments. Because I think that's a conversation we in the West need to learn how to lean into and have meaningfully. And we've got somebody with us today, I think, that is going to just be a gift to us in this conversation. Dr. Deirdre Latz is the principal and a senior lecturer at the Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, England. She was born in Canada, then moved to the United Kingdom, where she has served in pastoral roles and now serves as the principal of our college. I'm going to let her kind of share a little bit more about her story here in just a moment as well. But before I do that, I would like Dr. Mark Quandstrom, who is the Dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, to welcome everybody, but also to share with you the unique relationship that Olivet Nazarene University has had with Dr. Deirdre Latz over these last few years, and to speak to that a little bit and to welcome you and to pray for us as we begin this conversation today.
Yes, welcome, Dr. Latz. So good to have you here today. And I consider Deirdre, Dr. Latz, Deirdre, a gift to the Olivet Nazarene University. About 5-6 years ago, maybe longer, 7 years ago, a chair was established by a cousin of mine. It's the Quandstrom Chair for Pastoral Leadership. It's an endowed chair, and it is oriented toward the support of pastoral leadership in general, but women in pastoral leadership in particular. And so when I became dean 5 years ago, I purposefully sought out catalytic leaders in the church who were women, obviously, and I asked Deirdre Latz 3 years ago, 4 years ago, if she would consider being the recipient of the Quandstrom Chair. It's a 2-year request, and I asked her twice because I value who she is as a person and who she is as a leader. And she has graciously agreed to be the recipient of the chair. So it is a gift to us that she accepted. I believe that with all my heart. We are better for it. So Dr. Brower Latz is the recipient of the Quandstrom Chair for Pastoral Leadership. And she has spoken on Olivet's campus a couple of years ago as a revival speaker. She comes and travels across the pond to teach for us. She's one of our more popular graduate professors. She raises the level of our graduate school by virtue of her expectations in the class. And again, it is I consider it again. I'll repeat myself, a gift that she's a part of the work we're doing here at Olivet. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I think it would be really helpful, and I'm always gently provoked by Dr. Brower Latz. And that's the highest compliment, to speak challenging words that are still gentle, I think, is a gift. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation today, thinking that I will once again today be challenged by how I think about things as well. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we're grateful for this day and this privilege that you've given for us to have a conversation, although separated by thousands of miles. And so, Lord, we're grateful for the technology that will allow others to participate in this. And I ask your blessing on the conversation. I ask for a sense of your presence and an awareness of the wisdom that comes from you. So, Lord, bless the conversation, guide it, and thank you for the great privilege we have of participating in it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. And I do want to highlight again that none of this would be possible without the support for the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, and for your support, Dr. Quandstrom. As a school of theology and Christian ministry, we are consistently committed to raising. You mentioned raising the bar on what we can provide to practitioners across our region, because we believe so deeply in the church. We're sort of unique. We are a unique faculty on the floor of our department, because many of us are still deeply engaged in the work of pastoral ministry weekly. So this isn't something that is theory for most of us. This is for all of us, something that we are regularly practicing, and we are learning how to do better even as we serve local congregations. And so I am thankful to be able to be a part of a team that is so supportive of these kind of conversations, that continue to stretch us and invite us to think more deeply and reflect more faithfully upon our theological practices and postures. And so thank you for that, Dr. Quandstrom, as well. Dr. Brower Latz, I want to ask you a question here. So one of the things that we've done with every one of our speakers is we've asked them to help us to get to know them a little bit better, because I think too often in these kinds of conversations we jump right into content, but content is informed by context and character, the kind of person that bears that content out. And so I'm one that loves to understand the narrative that informs someone's life and ministry and pursuits. And so I just wanted to invite you to share a bit of your story, your spiritual faith journey, growing up in a Christian home, wrestling with your call to vocational ministry, the shift from pastoral ministry to serving within a academic institution, and what that has meant for you as you've sought to bear witness and practice the faith of Jesus in your context.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, firstly. And also, I love the description of kind of gentle provocateur. That's quite funny. I try and be kind, but I also discover over and over again that I think quite differently, or perhaps it is about context and the shaping of your life that changes how you think. But my deep history is of very godly grandparents on both sides of my family. one side deeply wedded to the earth, and a farming family in Canada who had been pioneering, had moved from Tacoma, Washington on my grandmother's side up to Wainwright, Alberta, northern Alberta, and as a tiny child. And then my grandfather, who was a military veteran who received a parcel of land as part of the Canadian distribution of land after the Second World War. And so they're very hardy people and very can-do people. And my grandfather and grandmother, in order to keep the land, had to till or cultivate a quarter of a quarter in Canadian terms, which meant that within the first 3 years of homesteading. And so, just kind of back to the plow kind of people. And that's my dad's side. On my mum's side, my grandpa was born into a very large family. His dad died from injuries he'd received in the First World War when my grandpa was 13. And so he raised his brothers and sisters and took jobs, and then took a train with nothing but a little bit of money to God's Bible School somewhere in America from Canada. And he met my grandmother there, who was from a Pennsylvania Dutch family, and strongly Pennsylvania Dutch. So no buttons, no makeup, no jewelry, and kind of a thing. And they got married and then became missionaries ultimately. My grandfather was in the Nazarene world, and he became a district superintendent in Eastern Canada, the middle of Canada, Paterson, New Jersey. He lived in as a pastor, like just a very peripatetic lifestyle. And he then became a missionary to South Africa and Nigeria, and then Germany, and then South Africa again. And so very kind of deeply rooted spiritual formation. And then my own parents both were in the faith, kind of brought up, born, birthed, and lived out Jesus loving, but without losing, I would say, the passion that some people lose. Sometimes the second generation isn't as committed as the first, but my parents are not that way inclined. They're very vibrant Christians. And my dad farmed. My mum is a teacher. And then my dad, on a whim, I suppose, well, actually, my farming grandpa left school at grade 8 and was determined that all of his children would go to college and to Canadian Nazarene College. And so all 5 of his children were to do at least a year at college. And so my dad went, then came back to the farm after getting his degree. When he and my mum got married, they moved to Boston, to Eastern Nazarene College, where he did a further degree and my mum did a teaching degree. They moved back to Canada to farm. And then my dad wrote a letter to Professor F.F. Bruce in Manchester University to see if he could study the New Testament. And F.F. Bruce wrote back and said, if you can take an examination in Greek and pass it, I'll take you on. And so he was admitted to do his PhD when I was a little girl now. So he left farming, which is a huge identity shift, and came to Britain when I was 3 initially, and then went back and forth doing his PhD, working here at CNC, back to Britain, back to Canada, back to Britain, back to Canada, back to Britain. That was my growing up. And, very steadfast witness, my parents. My mum followed my dad, I think you could say, believing strongly in his calling, but then developed her own career and calling in special educational needs. So she's a specialist in autism and the autistic spectrum, and has herself now published 2 books for very prestigious press in Britain around autism. And, so these 2 kind of formational people and my grandparents, all very influential. I don't remember a time when I didn't know about Jesus. I don't remember a time when I didn't know about forgiveness and hope and justice. My family was highly interested in those things and really interested in debate and rigor and questioning. My dad at one point, I believe, questioned things a little bit too much and was put on some sort of list that meant that he was uninvited from lots of things for a little while, because of his challenging of the church. And I inherited that gene. I think, yeah, so I kind of said some of those threads there, though, are what has made me who I am. So I think there's a bit of me, obviously, I suppose, that has lent into Jesus, to use a kind of phrase. Discovering for myself who Jesus is something that happened over time. I think I had a couple of very strange or meaningful encounters in my late teens where I discovered forgiveness for myself, quite dramatically a couple of times, where I learned more about what it meant to be obedient. The last time we moved to Britain, I was 18. And so I had the chance to kind of reinvent myself into adulthood, which was helpful because I had had a ropey later teen experience. And, just discovered on the journey, I suppose, that I really did believe and want to follow Jesus. So, and it's a bit long-winded, but the kind of missionary side has been important, that we're people of mission, and the daring side, that we're willing to go places, the justice side, that it really matters what God thinks. And that my grandpa was a missionary in South Africa during apartheid was really significant, because there are some letters of him questioning the church's stance and being told that if he ever wanted to be highly regarded in the Nazarene church, he would stop questioning and just get on with being a missionary under apartheid. And so my grandparents were very subversive at that point, but I still had to really navigate quite a lot of shame, I think, around the church's acquiescence in apartheid and questioning my grandpa's mission experience within that, and trying to reconcile myself a bit to the Nazarene church as being complicit in injustice, and asking myself, how do we figure out how to not do that again? How do we become a people who recognize ahead of time what injustices look like? How do we have courage as a corporate body to engage with politics? How do we use the Bible? And how is that the hope and the heart of our being? Those kinds of questions then rattled around in my head. I heard, I wanted to study history in Canada, but as I said, like, we moved here. I came for a year initially with my mum and dad when they moved back. But then for very complex immigration reasons, I couldn't go to university here, or I would have to pay international student fees, which we couldn't afford. So I ended up doing theology for free at the college, because Nazarene professors' kids up to the age of 25 were allowed to take classes for free. And actually, it was really interesting. So my first class, I walked in, sat down, started the class, and it was just like coming home. It was really interesting. I loved it. I nursed as a nursing assistant all the time I studied for a long time, and then did my studies. And in several years of that, people were saying, "Oh, you should be a minister." And I kept saying, no, didn't want to be a minister, didn't feel called, or might have felt nudged, but didn't feel called, partly because I hadn't had many examples of women in leadership, certainly none that resonated with how I imagined I wanted to be. And mostly they were single, and I had a big question about that. There are just lots of things. And eventually I felt God's call through the preaching of Tom Meese at a conference on compassionate ministry in Germany. And so my call and vocation was very much attached to compassionate ministry and preaching. And at the time, I was in a relationship with somebody who I thought I would marry a minister, that kind of thing. And when I said that I felt like I was called to be a minister and that God had called me to pastor and lead and be an elder in the church, the man I was with said he couldn't be married to a minister. And so it was like kind of saying yes, being good, and then all your worst fears kind of coming to light immediately afterwards. So that was a very challenging little patch. But anyway, I persisted and became ordained. On our district, they didn't really know what to do with me. I was quite young, ordained. I became a pastor of youth, the district youth. We created a role for district youth pastoring. I think it was the first globally, but not the last. Pastoring particularly students who left Nazarene churches and went to cities where there weren't Nazarene churches. And so I would go and pastor them and visit them, drop in on them at uni, hang out with them. It was a brilliant job. And simultaneously, I moved to an urban estate in Bristol, intending to be there as one of 3, but the other 2 didn't ever come. And so my first week there, my door was kicked in, I was burgled repeatedly, and the one woman who was supposed to join me kind of 4 months later phoned and said, I can't face living in those conditions. And then the guy who was supposed to come as part of the team moved to America to be a youth pastor. And so I was left in Bristol, pastoring a little tiny church of really hurting people. And when I say tiny, I mean 6 people, tiny. Although there were 20 odd on the register, but several of them were lost, and a lot had died and were still on the register. And so just lots of things like that. And that was a really hard learning experience, because I realized that it didn't matter how much you worked, you could potentially not grow a church. Like there had to be something else going on, of chemistry, of spirit. And then eventually I was called to Manchester, initially to work full-time at the college. I hated it. I needed to be in pastoral ministry. So I was also non-stipendiary at a local church, again in an inner city that I lived right near it. And through a set of circumstances, I became the lead pastor of a team of a tiny church, 15 people or so, called Longsight. And I was there for the next 12 years, teaching at the college to earn, like bivocational basically, so that I could pastor the church. But the church grew remarkably. Again, a really good lesson, because I didn't do much differently. It was the same person, a bit older. But some of my old youth group came and moved into the area as well. And there was just a different energy. The church grew and is now one of the healthiest churches on the district here, kind of 100 and plus in membership and the congregation, are very faithful people, but also healthy in the sense that like immersed in a vision for community and for transformation, and theologically rich and complex. And then I was a bit pot bound there. I don't know if that translates into American. Probably does. It's a gardening term. Like when your roots are in a pot. And for a variety of things, I felt like something needed to change. And then I was asked if I'd consider being principal of the college. And initially I was like, no, like it was a disaster me being full-time, honestly, as a faculty member, really. And so why would I become a full-time principal? But then it didn't seem right to say no. So I said, well, I'll say yes and see what happens. I'd been working on my PhD in the background here, and I got that at some point there. And anyway, I was interviewed, and what I presented to the college governors at that point was a vision for the college of it as a place of transformational community, justice, stepping into its own legacy, actually, of non-traditional entry routes, of accessible education, these kinds of things. And they appointed me unanimously, and here I am. And it was really interesting. Like the first year, I was really devastated because I'd lost I felt like I'd lost a very rich engagement in what my call was: compassionate ministry, edge stuff. And yet within that first year, well, the back end of my first year, we had over 15%, I think, of our students then came from a drug and rehabilitative background. And God knew, right? Like, I was the perfect principal for them because that's who I'd been working with. And that ministry has grown. And the justice practices of the college, I would say, our kind of influence and shape and desire to be part of transformation, our reach in the neighborhood, the use of our land, the pay rates we give, all of those things were part of where we are. The placements that our students engage with, all of those things have been what I've invested the last little while in, while still preaching and being engaged in urban churches and living in a very challenging street, which is a story in and of itself. I think we might move. We can talk about that in a bit, because that's a process of discernment, actually, about when you're done in a place. But anyway, that was really long-winded, Jeff. I hope it gave you kind of a snapshot of it all. But like, the threads are there, right? Like, the land really matters to me. I think that's my farming heritage. Justice really matters to me. I think that's the complex reality of my parents. It's not unattached to the land that the farm is on, because that was not their land to have. A colonial government gave it to my grandpa. And so there's that. Then there's, from the other side, the mission, the travel, the immersion in the church, the challenging the church, all of those woven in to my amazing parents who birthed us and have just let us be, what kind of sagely wisdom in the background, but just let us do our thing and support us, and are absolutely loyal to the church. And then me, who's a very angsty, holily discontent, I hope, but kind of a person who doesn't settle for easy answers, and is now leading an institution, which is quite funny, really, because institutions have a way of crushing you into the shape of the institution. And so one of my questions is, how do you help an institution be holy? So those kinds of things are all there for me. So I'll shut up now.
No, Deirdre, this is great, and I feel like I need to ask you a question that I hadn't intended to ask you, but given some of the things that you've said, I feel like there's something here that would resonate with a lot of the people that will watch this later, and that is the reconciling work that you've had to do throughout your life. Reconciling the witness of your parents and your grandparents and your experience of the Nazarene Church, in growing up in it, discovering who you are, discovering Jesus amid it, and then also the complexities of when the church fails to be its best self for the sake of the world, and how you reconciled those things, because I know there's going to be people watching this that are in that place of reconciliation. They're trying to understand, how do I hold on to that which I know has been so central and vital to my life, at the same time seeing things that I don't understand how we can be or not be this. Yeah. Can you talk to us? Because I think now it's easy for people to look and go, look at the things that Deirdre is doing there at NCC, but not knowing the story of how you had to move through that and reconcile those things and hold those things together so that you could find yourself able to call us back into our witness as the church in some very unique and hope-filled ways. So how have you reconciled that?
Well, so it's not past tense. That's the first thing I would say. I'm reconciling. It's an ongoing act. And I think that there is always the possibility that there will be a tipping point where you can no longer reconcile. I think. So I'll just say that up front. I think it's like a verb. It's an active verb. And I would say that it's a bit like Peter's conversion in Acts, I think. Like he's converted already, then he screws up, then he kind of converts again, deepens his faith in an act of forgiveness, and then he's got the taboo breaking moment where he's converted. Like there's just multiple points where conversion happens and new, deeper reconciliation has to happen, I think, as a way of obedience. And I suppose that points there's brokenness within that. So that's not a very articulate way of saying this. Let me start again. I think that we exist in a broken middle. That's my husband's phrase from his PhD, but where we know the ideal and we know the reality, and somewhere in that middle space, we cling on to God and God's work with all our might. And that no hate is allowed to be sustained in us, though that would be easy. And where we refuse to make enemies of people, and where we refuse to think the worst of people, but we don't accept that when the worst is displayed, it can be unchallenged, like it has to be challenged. And so I would say that I am a thorn in the flesh of the church. And I think that at the moment, our church is in a huge existential crisis about how to be. And is it narrow or is it open? Is it holiness as legal or is it holiness as expansive? Is it creative and new pots are being molded? Or is it uncreative and the pots will eventually crack because they can't do the job they need anymore? Where's the place for new wine? And so I think all of that is deeply uncomfortable. So I think I would say, like, if you ever hope that a church would be comfortable, I mean, I suppose some might be, but that's never been my experience. And I guess at the moment, one of the things I am afraid of for the church is that we would repeat what happened in the 70s and 80s in South Africa, for example, where retrospectively the church has said, of course that was sin. Forgive us. Of course we should have spoken out. Of course we should have aligned ourselves with churches who were acting for justice and humanizing of people and the recognition of all people created in God's image. Of course, that's a retrospective look at the Nazarene Church in South Africa. Every conference of the church has had that moment for the last 20 years, maybe, Mark, right? Where some leader has said, we're sorry for what we did under apartheid. My thing at the moment is, how do we make sure that in this present time, we're not creating a set of circumstances that 20 years from now, our church looks back and says, I'm sorry we weren't more, oh, sorry, that's my telephone. I'm sorry we weren't more bold around the reality that people matter in the fullness of their lives, not just in our preferred way of life for them. Or I wish that the church would be stronger around saying, actually, the beautiful call to holiness is about absolute love of God and love of neighbor. And when you love your neighbor, you love them before they behave in ways that you might like. Like, you don't kind of say to people, yeah. So, I mean, I think, so how do I perceive the Nazarene Church and how do I stay reconciled, if you like, to it? My grandpa doesn't let me dismiss the church in its flaws because he was an amazing Christian, but he served apartheid in a way because he was a missionary under it. So I can't dismiss his faith that's not how he operated. And yet I can completely say my grandpa did something wrong there. And so, yeah, the reconciling goes on, and I kind of bring that forward into today, and I say, all right, so in this current moment for the church, how do we be holy people who have courage, who aren't afraid to name sin, of course, and yet who say, actually, Jesus taught a lot more about a lot more than just sin. Like there's healing, forgiveness, mercy, changing of the law, reinterpretation, new hermeneutics. There's willingly going to places that are hard. There's learning along the way. There's a discipling community that's allowed to be flawed and allowed to be in. His inner circle is full of flaw, and yet it's his inner circle. And so those kinds of things, I think, are really important, because I do often, like, I'm just being right out there, eh, Mark? Sorry. You can edit this as you want, guys.
We are not going to edit this. And I want to follow up when you're done, because I want to pick up on a couple things that you said that I'm grateful that you said.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I just think, like, I love the Church of the Nazarene, right? It's in my DNA. But that doesn't mean I am blind to its imperfections and unwilling to call them out. And so I think there's that. And then there's also the sense for me of who am I following? Like, I'm called to follow Jesus. Oh, so where is Jesus? Where is he right now? And how do I sit with him? Like, okay, so all of that is here. And so those kinds of questions, Jeff, like, they really shape me. And, you know, I feel really heavy. I have to say, like, I feel heavy about this in a way I hadn't probably for a long time. But I feel like I watch some of my students and some of my friends, some of my colleagues leaving the Nazarene Church, and it hurts me. And I say to myself, like, does that mean that I'm actually complicit and old guard and institutionalized now? Like, is my staying wrong? Mm-hmm. I need to navigate that space. But I also always think, well, where would I go? Mm-hmm. Which church could you plunge into that doesn't have its own log or a speck in its eye? So I don't know. I mean, that's a very complex answer, but it's really tricky. And I think, you know, as I don't know if Olivet has a similar reality, but I feel like I'm gifted as a leader with lives of people who are beautiful, and my job is never to oppress, it's to liberate and to be part of a redeeming community that is a microcosm of the kingdom. And so how do I sit within that and strive for that within a college community and within the church community and so on? And, you know, it is really tricky. Like, my street is a salvific place, although I did just say I might move soon, but it has been a place where I've had to work out for 16 years now how to love people without them changing to conform to what I want. I don't think any one of my neighbors is a Christian, though they will now ask me to pray for them. And we did steal, or not steal, that's the wrong word. We appropriated or commandeered a piece of land that was wasteland behind our houses. And we've made it into a community garden over the last 4 years. And when we gather out there, like during coronavirus, that was saving grace. And when we would gather out there and talk, and I would talk about prayer and life and refugees and asylum seeking and all of these kinds of things with my neighbors, I think I was catching lots of little glimpses of how Jesus was pitching up. And so, but funnily enough, sometimes I see that more in my neighbors and the connection there than I have seen it in some other spaces I've stepped into, where actually it's more about creating other than it is creating kingdom and kinship. So
Mm-hmm.
that's hard, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So you said ropey earlier.
Did I? Yes.
So I had to look it up. I wasn't sure what a ropey adolescent meant.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm not going to say what ropey means. I'm just going to let our viewers look it up themselves to find out what in the world you meant when you said you had a ropey adolescent. So I love that. And thank you for the clarification on whatever the phrase was about being too big for the pot that you're placed in.
Oh, yeah, pot bound, yeah.
Pot bound, is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Very descriptive, yeah. Pot bound might be where we and pot bound might be how we always have to be.
Yeah, I mean, if something is growing, it becomes pot bound.
It does, and that's really painful to leave the pot that you're in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is.
Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, that's true. Like, we've got an apple tree that's in an enormous pot, and the only way now for it to flourish is that we have to smash the pot so we can replant it.
But but usually it feels wrong, doesn't it? To smash the pot, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful pot. It's like terracotta glazed. Right. I have to smash it, but without smashing it, the apple tree which bears fruit will die.
Correct. I mean, so you said I don't remember exactly the phrase you used, but you talked about becoming institutionalized. That's my word, not yours. But you know what I'm making reference to. As a president, as a principal of a university, the institution tries to form you. I think that's how you said it.
Mm-hmm.
So always being aware of the institutionalizing process of an institution is crucial then for us to stay continually following Jesus. How's that?
Yeah, that's right.
Jesus always challenges. And so I just wanted to say, yes, in this way, classic understanding of the church in this world is the militant church, right? It's not the triumphant church. It means we're always at war, right? And I think sometimes we interpret the church militant as the church holy militating against the world, right? That's the church militant. I think that's how we typically understand it.
Yeah.
But if you look at the first century church, there was nothing but ferment there. There was no agreed upon much of anything, as you mentioned to Peter, this continually conversion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the angst arises because we've in our theological tradition is more inclined to it by virtue of our claim to be able to realize holiness in this world. I think our theological tradition inclines us to be unreflective and not non-confessional and needing to have arrived for the sake of assurance. And so I think a lot of us are unprepared for the internally necessary militant nature of church, if that makes sense. So the struggle should never be out there. The struggle should be here. And if we're in the Reformation tradition, we shouldn't be surprised that this continually reforming church is what we have to participate in, right? I mean, so your comment that you are presently reconciling yourself to the denomination, I think is probably healthier because it speaks of being watchful and careful and serious and theological.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a practical theologian by trade, so to speak. And I guess one of the things that practical theology gifts to the church is the importance of significance of experience. And experience as interrogating other things. And yeah, so I think the kind of I'm not just reconciling myself to the Nazarene church, incidentally. It's to the church, probably. But the Nazarene church specifically, because that's my birth church, if you like. But I do think there's something frightening about Reformation. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that I haven't always felt frightened. And I don't mean that I'm like overridden with fear or anything, but I do think there's different ways of reforming, right? There's reforming where that which is being reformed is able to stay, but become a bit more or be different or reshaping, let's say. And then there's reforming that's kind of iconoclastic or that destroys something else or hates it almost. If it hate, despises or disdains or sets aside. And I guess at different points in my life, I might have told a different story about how I felt. Like I think I've navigated through lots of different hurts in relation to the church, or kind of tendency, I suppose, to think, well, actually, I just have to become local. So when I was pastoring Longsight, which is a vibrant, healthy community now, to get there, we were local. Everything was local. And so the big stuff was almost irrelevant, honestly. And to some extent, that's important, I think, that actually we're people of the soil, and it's the local expression that really should be shaping us. If it's not, then we're in real trouble, because our theology is like out there somewhere and our practice is here. And so, but yeah, you're kind of church militant. I am never keen on that language of militancy, because I think you're right. I think it does tend towards the kind of crusader model of life. Mm-hmm. And so I liked that you switched it out for ferment. I do like the idea of yeast and salt and light. And I've not read the book, but I heard you say the title Radiant Church, I think. I mean, that's a lovely title, because wouldn't it be nice if we were radiant in a positive way and not radioactive in a toxic way? And so, there's different ways of glowing. So it would be lovely if it was radiant. But leavening, and I don't know what it's like in America, but I feel like the coronavirus pandemic has brought a great reckoning to the church in Britain. And some of what is left is micro church. And so that will be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, so I wanted to thank you for including in your narrative the holiness of pastoring 6 people, or the worthiness of pastoring a church, a small church of what when you first went there, and also,
I love small churches.
Well, I mean, yeah, and your what was I going to say? So I love small churches too, but your description of your work in the one not bearing the same kind of fruit that your work in the other, although you are the same person, which mandates a more expansive understanding of fruit than we typically probably have, at least here in the US. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So the nurturing of those 6.
Oh, I could tell you, I mean, Bristol as a congregation taught me much more in many ways. I learned an awful lot. So there was a lady in the church who had a phobia of the police, and who was quite mentally ill, quite disturbed, really. And she would always have her hair over her face, like that cousin in the Addams Family. Mm-hmm. And when I went, she would, I mean, it was a really, really strange church. But when I went there, she would scuttle in after the service started and scuttle out at the end of it. And her family was quite notorious on the estate that I was living on. And I'm not exaggerating at all. I would get a death threat every Sunday morning from this particular family, a quite networked family. we're going to kill you, like all of this, quite traumatizing initially. And then she would show up at church and it was her brother that would be making the threats. And so it was a really strange thing. But actually, I don't know how long into my ministry there, but a group of Nazarene young people came over to work with me for a summer from Brazil. And the pastor there, a guy called Amaral Duresh, and we were talking one day and he just said, there's something really wrong with her. And I said, I know. And he said, have you exorcised her? And I was like, no, not like, that's not very British. No. And so we prayed. I asked her permission, obviously, and said, we'd like to anoint you and pray for you that you could be healed. And she said, all right then, to my shock. And then we sat her in the middle of this little sanctuary and he poured a bottle of olive oil over her, and the Brazilian young people and me gathered around and laid hands on her and prayed. And I am not exaggerating when I say that her entire demeanor changed. And about 4 or 5 months later, and like you could see her face. And 4 or 5 months later, I saw a local police officer who said to me, now then, what have you done to our Linda? And I said, oh, what do you mean? And she said, she's seen me and I've arrested Linda 135 times for attacking police. And I haven't arrested her once in the last 4 months. And I was just like, oh, that's Jesus. And she was transformed. So she was 1 out of 6 people. But like, how significant is that? And her, and the former pastor of the church had been there. He'd been really hurt by the Nazarene church and the district. And he would come and he would not participate. So he's the 5th of my 6, right? And over the time I was there, after about a year, there was this huge pulpit and I stopped using the pulpit, like a massive pulpit, 6 people, 30 rows. What? No. So I've been using a table with a load of books stacked on it as my pulpit. And he had left pastoring and was now a joiner, like a carpenter. And on Easter Sunday, after a year, he phoned me up and said, will you come to church early? And I said, sure. And I walked over to church thinking, I wonder what's gone on. Oh, and the other thing was, on the middle of the wall at the back, there had been a Nazarene logo. And I kept taking it off and putting like paper cross on the wall. And somebody would put the Nazarene logo back and I would take it off. And we had this little dance every week, right? And I came in on Easter Sunday after I'd been there a year. He met me at the door. He said, I'm going to blindfold you. Don't be scared. He walked me into the church and he had built a pulpit and put a cross on the wall. And I was just like, this is healing. And he was healed and we prayed and we talked about like reconcile to the church. And I could tell you story after story after story about Bristol Southmead Church, which actually closed after I left, sold its manse or its vicarage or whatever, the building that the pastor lived in, sold it, put the money into a fund for new starts in Bristol, sold the building to the local scouts so that they could use it. To help young people on the estate, which is one of the worst estates in Britain for racism. And the Boy Scouts bought the building. And so like, I felt like this little church seeded hope, even though the church left. And each of those people who was in the church at that point joined another congregation, 1 Anglican and the rest Methodist, and 1 Baptist. And so actually, did I fail? Well, I mean, sure, in Nazarene terms, you close a church down, it's like, 1 strike and you're out. These women, they can't pastor churches. But actually, that's not what happened there. If I could tell the story differently again earlier about how Bristol became healed, even though it then died. Like it died as a seed dies, not as a corpse dies, if you see what I mean.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here, Deirdre? Sorry.
Jeff, before I'm at my church, and I've got to tend to one thing here at my church. And so, speaking of practical theologian,
Go for it.
I'm gonna be gone for about 90 seconds. I'll be right back.
Sorry, Jeff.
No. This has been rich, and I want to explore. I want to explore something you said about the nature of Reformation. Right? You talked about how we're being reformed, and I'm going to tip my hat just theologically here and show my cards for a minute, and then maybe we can have a conversation about that. I think part of one of the challenges for what you're describing about that ongoing reconciling work is a misunderstanding of both evangelism and eschatology within, and maybe an insufficient understanding. So I make the assumption that the church is always being evangelized in the sense that if we're really proclaiming the euangelion, the coming of God's kingdom, then that happens every week. And so the church is always bumping up against the idolatries, the injustices that we participate, our actions of living in this broken middle, right? So we're always, and that's, you talked about this constant sense of conversion. Yeah. But if we adopt a one-dimensional view of evangelism, where that's something that happened once, and there's a destination of heaven where we arrive to, it's in many ways it makes anemic the mission of God.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I find interesting about the kinds of ministries that you're describing, the spaces that you've inhabited, the lives that you've bumped up against, is that if the church takes seriously the mission of God, and this is where I think in the urban environment in particular can be a unique opportunity and gift to the church. If the church takes seriously the mission of God, then it's constantly bumping up against difference. And that bumping up against difference reminds us that we can't be content or comfortable in our insular understandings of the world or our theologies, that because our eschatology speaks to God's bringing things into its beauty, the way in which God intends things to come, and that's an ongoing process until God fully consummates that, and we are participants bearing witness to that. That it should continue to stretch us. So let me ask you this, and again, I don't want to draw you into the theological cards I just laid on the table, making the assumption that you would agree with everything I said. That's not my goal here. My thought is here, could you, given what I've just said and what you've explained about Reformation, can you explain to me how being located uniquely within the context of urban terrain, in a post-Christian environment, in a context that is multicultural and pluralistic, and maybe I'm making too many assumptions about the world of England, and you can correct me, please, if I am. But what unique opportunities has that availed you to in some of that way in which you understand the reconciling work of the church and the expansive vision of what we are called to be and how we have to reframe and how we're being constantly converted? How has the unique urban environment or the environments that you have found yourself in post-Christendom availed yourself towards that kind of posture?
I think, I don't know that it's unique to urban. I'll say that. I think that what the world that I live in is one where it's really imperative that you look for life in concrete and brick, and you celebrate it when you see it. And where you co-labor with other people who are hoping to bring life to a place. I'm not sure I'm doing justice to your question. Ask it again. Just say it again.
Yeah, so I think, as I understand, one of the challenges that we face, the church can very easily become insular.
Yeah.
And much of our challenge of being in this constant reformation process is that we sort of live in the confirmation biases and echo chambers of our insular activities as the church, our insular postures, our insular even theological articulations, and none of that's questions. But if you take seriously the mission of God, and that's sending us out.
Right, gotcha.
I mean, Peter's conversion again in Joppa is in relationship to his life is about to bump up against difference. So talk to me about how your life of ministry has had you bumping up against difference that's continually invited you to question and rethink through your postures.
Yeah, that was helpful. Sorry, I was tracking with you, and then my brain kind of went and tracked in a different way. So I think I think that the problem with urban ministry is that quite often we think we're saving and heroic, and that's not true, that God is saving and God is active. And so the discipline is to be trying to discern what God is doing around you and join it. And I think that particularly when you're kind of young and passionate and radical, the idea of moving or living somewhere that's urban appeals to a kind of character, like my own, if you like. And that you have to kind of have the heroic mode chiseled away. And you have to figure out that when God looks at a place, God's eyes, look with love on a place. And so that's kind of the first lens that you have to learn to see through. And that, again, I look at Jesus and his mode of operation, and I think Jesus could have stood on the outside judging, but instead immersed. And because he was immersed, was able to speak. And he spoke from his being and his credibility and his joy at being with people, not his disdain for them and his hate of them and his judgment of them. Now, I know that there are places where Jesus judges, but quite often it's the religious leaders, or it's the people who are judging themselves to be the judges. And I love the idea, I can't remember who it is, it might be Pete Greig or Shane Claiborne, somebody in that world, who says that one of the things that we're called to do now as church is to be the stone catchers. I'm really captivated by that picture where, it's drawn from the story of the adulterous woman. And, here she is kneeling on the ground, and Jesus is saying to the leaders, like, which of you has, throw your stones then. And in the story, they drop their stones and walk away. The contention now is that religious people don't drop their stones anymore, they throw them. And so what would Jesus do next? If they'd started throwing the stones, where would Jesus have gone? And the idea is, of course, that he would have stood in front of the woman and taken the stones. And I find that a really compelling picture. It leaps into the cross, doesn't it, really? And so I think, all right, so if my job is to be a stone catcher, okay, there's that. And then there's the notion that we're also to be people who speak truth to power and of power. And in Britain, in my street, the church doesn't have a brilliant reputation. And so I never hide from the fact that the church has done wrong with my neighbors. Or I often speak of my wish that the church I'm a part of did better. Or I talk about the practices of my church that are good. And so, like, I had a conversation at the bakery down the road yesterday. We were talking about, so there's a homeless man outside, and there's like a system you can pay it forward, right? And so we're chatting about homelessness, and this lad and I had gotten chatting, and he was just out of prison. When you get out of prison in Britain, you get £32.60 for a week, or £65 for 2 weeks. he's been let out of prison with £32.60, gone to live with his girlfriend. She's kicked him out because, after all, he's now a prisoner who's probably got lots of issues. So he's homeless, street homeless, living in the Klondike, which is a pub down the road here. So I'm chatting with him, talking about all of this. I go in and I say to this group of people, there were 3 bakers and me, because it's only one person in a shop at a time. And I just say, this lad needs like a pastry and coffee, and let's sort that out. And then we got chatting about prison, and I just said this data that I knew from pastoring prisoners a lot. And I said, none of us could live on that, could we? And they're like, no, it's dreadful. And we're having this chat about compassion. And then I just said, actually, over Lent in our church, we had a challenge where we were all challenged to live on £32.60 a week for Lent and give the remainder of what we would normally budget away. And I said, like, nobody lasted. And they all laughed and they're like, yeah. And then we had a chat but it was normal. It was church. It was Jesus. It was compassion. This is in the bakery at 7:30 in the morning with a homeless guy outside who then got pastry and a drink. And they said, we'll sort him out from here on out. Like, let's talk to him. And Jordan, the guy who runs the bakery, who went out and said, all right, mate, come here in the morning and we'll give you coffee and a pastry. I consider that to be an act of the kingdom. Yeah. But did anybody in that moment come to Jesus? Well, yeah, everybody did. If you see what I mean, including the lad outside. Now, did they come in a sense that means that tomorrow morning they're going to pitch up at the local Anglican church, which is our local? No, I doubt it. But I promise you that the lady who serves in the bakery, she's a journalist, and we've been talking. She's from Poland originally, and we buy our bread from this local bakery every Thursday. And every Thursday I have a conversation with her, and we chat about justice. And she knows I'm a Christian and that I talk about Jesus, and she asks questions. And I've been going there when it opened. It's like its 10th year anniversary. But it's slow and steady. I've lived 16 years in my street, and I could tell you story after story about the transformation of the street. But I don't think anybody has converted to Jesus in a conventional way. But our street is shaped differently. Now, do I trust Jesus to be doing something with my street? I do, yeah. I do actually. And do I recognize that I am not the only Christian that people will encounter? And that there's something of the church going on that's bigger and beyond me? All of those questions. So that's a kind of long-winded answer to your question there, Jeff. But I feel like in the space between, where we're called to be, there's real life because God's at work.
Right.
And so I think it's that, isn't it? It's trying to say, and also there's death where the principalities and powers are at work. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to challenge death because it's defeated ultimately. Mm-hmm. And I'm supposed to amplify life and recognize it and name it and share it and shape it. That's kind of the theological framing that I work with. And I work that out daily because of the neighborhood I live in.
Can I call you back to something you said that was, I thought, really important? It has to do with posture. And you used the term, if you come in, a certain character is inclined to be heroic in the city, and so they're bringing light to those in the dark. So I don't think we're ever out of the Gnostic heresy very far. And so I think contemporary soteriology is, I've got it, I have the knowledge, I have been enlightened, and I'm a light bringer, right? So so that precludes me identifying with others in any way that I might be like them. And our theological tradition has inclined us to that kind of posture toward the other, that I'm different because I have the knowledge, or I have the knowledge. I think that's what I have to say.
Holiness.
Yeah. Well, what if I'm still in that space always? What if I'm never not needing to be confessional? What if I'm being saved presently? And what if the difference between me and the other is simply, I'm even afraid to say what the difference might be, but that I recognize the mercy of the Lord in my life. And that is the message, that since I have received mercy, you can receive mercy, and we are brothers and sisters. So this Gnostic heresy influences us still, that we somehow have something that we have to share, instead of saying we are all together in the need for God's mercy. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've never attached it to Gnosticism. I've always attached it to arrogance, but maybe you're right. Like, maybe it is a kind of Gnostic heresy. I mean, I think you're right, Mark. Like, the idea that there's a secret knowledge that separates you. And this is it's a holiness heresy, isn't it?
It is.
That we're not truly human. We're truly holy.
Correct.
And that our humanness is gone. I mean, I think, and so like pastoring, if I use Longsight as an example, we were based near 3 hostels, a hostel for abused women and 2 hostels, one for recovering alcoholics and drug addicts, and one for newly out of prison people. And very early on pastoring the church, I brought in prayers of confession, and a prayer of absolution. And I remember talking at the time to somebody who was like, well, Nazarenes don't confess, do they? And I said, well, these Nazarenes do, because actually these guys are like one knock on the door away from a relapse, and the temptation that they're grappling with, and all of this. And so actually the hooking in of our lives on a weekly basis of a reminder that we come to God humbled to confess and forgiven, that mode of existence is really important within that space. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's about the mercy we've received, the forgiveness we know, the Jesus. I mean, I don't want to pretend that as Christians, we do believe, don't we, that like Jesus is doing something. And when we align our lives with Jesus, transformation happens. And that alignment and reorientation of our direction of travel changes everything about us, our values, our speech, our attitudes. Like, I would have to say that people on my street other and scapegoat and create enemies. So I do act uniquely in my street, because that's not what Jesus calls us to.
Well, so the radical refusal to other would be very revelatory to those who to all of us who are inclined to, right? And the other part of this that I was thinking, so when Jesus said, whoever was without sin cast the first stone, what he was saying was, folks, you're there. If you throw the stone, it will hit you, right? I mean, he was universalizing that woman's condition. So this idea that we are somehow different or exempt or not in need of the greatest mercy that God might have to offer is incredibly destructive.
It is. I mean, it's a discipline though, isn't it? Like, I think people who've grown up in Christian homes and families, to see themselves as potential murderers, adulterers or whatever, I think there's a discipline there. Like, one of my friends is a convicted murderer, and we talk about compassion and mercy and forgiveness. And one of the things, he was blown away by the congregation kind of still caring for him, because it's a very complex situation. But whenever I am talking to him and with him, like, I will always say to him, like, actually, you had a very different threshold than I do for murder. He lived at a 9, and if murder is 10, because he'd been raped as a child, as a drug addict, in and out of prison. It is a matter of background and sociological phenomena and input that led to us having very divergent worlds. But could I murder, right? Or yes. I mean, so it's all of those things, isn't it? And it's kind of saying we never want to diminish that Jesus breaks cycles, Jesus transforms lives, Jesus realigns us, reorientates us, and that the people in my street who do hate others, like you can't romanticize people either. Maybe that's what I'm saying.
No, this is your
and you can't pretend that there's no need for Jesus. That's what I'm saying too. Like that's, it's tricky, because I feel like if I'm listening to this conversation and I'm from a very conservative viewpoint, I think people might say, but you're diminishing the role of Jesus to save and transform in a moment. And I'm not doing that, actually.
No.
But I'm also saying, on the other hand, when Jesus saves in a moment, there is then a lifetime's journey of transformation. And that's true for all of us.
Correct.
And likewise, sometimes, for whatever reason, it appears that Jesus saves repeatedly over time, and that it's not necessarily a sudden shift, but it's a progression towards, and then there's something else. So like I have this lovely friend in our congregation who says to me, like, she bounded up to me one day a couple of Christmases ago and just said, Deirdre, she'd been coming to church for a while, just, Deirdre, I just need to tell you, I've been activated in Jesus. Brilliant. It was like her phone had been activated, right? Like, I've been activated in Jesus. Like she was just waiting to be turned on. It was the most wonderful description, because actually it's kind of true, right? Like, yeah, Jesus loves you all along, and now you're activated in Jesus. It's something new and rich and different in her life, and that's the kind of hope of it. I mean, anyway, Jeff, you'd kind of asked about the secular environment, and I didn't pick that up much.
That's okay. This conversation has gone some amazing directions, and I'm just so thankful for it. I feel like we could I feel like we could do another conversation at some point, because I think there's such richness here. As I'm listening to you describe kind of what I've been experiencing here in my neighborhood, Deirdre, it's again, I feel like perhaps one of the greatest challenges that the Church of the Nazarene faces is that we treat our doctrine on eschatology as an addendum to the rest of our articles. And because we leave that towards the end, and you can really kind of believe whatever you want about eschatology, as long as you'll just say at the end of the day, Jesus comes back, you're good to go. And what I think what I'm hearing from you, and what I'm discerning, is that when eschatology is rooted in a kingdom understanding, right? This idea of the kingdom breaking in, it postures you in a place of wonder. And wonder in the sense that I now move out into the world anticipating to see the places in which that kingdom is breaking in. Because here's my concern, because soteriology, when we talk about it, moves so quickly to individualism, right? Into sort of the isolated individual. And yet, if we're anticipating that soteriology is rooted in eschatology, this idea of the inbreaking of the kingdom of God, and we're moving out into spaces where we're anticipating God's wonder may be breaking in, that I didn't bring, that I'm catching a glimpse of, or I'm joining at him in what he's already up to. And that salvation is happening. Now, that salvation may just mean someone is activated in Jesus. Someone is recognizing that God has just invited me into this participation in this inbreaking kingdom. Oh, and by the way, once I die, I get heaven as well. But there's this richness and fullness that I get to participate as one who has been reclaimed, and my identity has been transformed, and I've been engrafted into this community of people who are living out this sort of kingdom way. that I think for me, as I even think about post-Christendom becomes the gift, because Christendom as a model, I think means that there's certain assumptions about what we expect from the world, or what our role is to the world. Whereas post-Christendom forces us instead to, if we refuse to see it simply as an encroaching threat that could cause the demise of everything good and holy and Christian, but instead see it as the space in which God may disrupt, show up, and surprise and shock us with his goodness, that it can become a gift that humbles the church, that invites the church to step into this space as learners once again, right? As participants, as dependent upon God, as kenotic evangelizers, right? Who we just sort of poured out into the world, and into this world where there's some opportunity for us to discover God in maybe ways that we hadn't ever anticipated amongst people. You're telling stories, Deirdre, and I always go back to this moment. I do a lot of work on religion and violence. I have a military background, and so my conversion came in the military. I had to then square, I follow Jesus, and now I'm reading this one who seems to be opposed to some of my natural assumptions, right? So I've done a lot of reading and study about religious violence. So I'm sitting in my cafe, and I'm reading a book on religious violence. And my friend from Lebanon, who is a Muslim, comes walking in. He says, "Jeff, what are you reading?" And I told him. He goes, "Oh, I got something to say about that." And so he sits down, and we start having a conversation about religion and violence. And then my friend from Australia, she is an avowed atheist, and she comes in and she said, "What are you two talking about over here so passionately?" And I said, "Well," and I told her, and she goes, "Oh, I got something to say about that." And so she sits down, and then a good friend of mine who is an activist here in the city in the LGBTQI community, she comes in and she says, "What are you three talking about?" So we told her, and she said, "Oh, I got something to say about that." And then they turned to me and they said, "Well, what does Jesus have to say about that, Christian?" And all of a sudden, there in this moment, people who are concerned deeply about things that matter are having conversations in which Jesus is bubbling up to the surface because he can't help it. And there's something about an environment like that forces us to rethink our postures to the world around us, and where we see the kingdom breaking in, and the kinds of conversations we see God using to be catalysts for his grace and love and work of justice in this world. And so I want to just say how much I've been thankful for and appreciated this conversation, because I think it can provide hope for the church. Hope not only of just simply reconciling who we are to the church consistently, as I myself have to be reconciled to her, because I am also at times very much part of the problem. Like I think for me, it's always a dual thing, right? I not only have to make space for her, she has to continually make space for me. Because if she doesn't make space for me, then I'm out on my own. Like I can't ever stand above what the space that she as the church has to make for me as well. But also that the stories you're describing, the conversations we've had here, for me provide this sense of hope that there is this world of God's redemptive grace and beauty out there, that if we can step into and find in the small places of those little congregations, in those broken neighborhoods and streets that we live on for 15, 16 years, in the face of the man who's living on the 3260, like if we can find God in the midst of, there's something beautiful to that.
Yeah, and be rooted. I mean, I guess I'd just say it can be exhausting, and so like being rooted and sourced well in a good well with fresh water, that's important. Like, I'm conscious, I've alluded a couple of times to the possibility of moving, but we've got nightmare neighbors who kept us awake for weeks on end now. And so the the vocational questions then come, right? Like, how do you do this? How do we navigate it? How do you discern where God's calling you to and from and into? And yeah, just not to interrupt you there, but like, actually, again, just the sense that when God calls you, God's faithful and equips you. And yeah, that kind of ability to have the lens to see the world around you in the kingship, kinship, kingdom eyes, like, that's really significant, but it has to come from somewhere. Like, it's not from ourselves. We can't manufacture it or whip it up. It's kind of Jesus stuff, isn't it?
Yes. Well, Deirdre, this has been. I want to stay as true to time here as possible, and this has been just, again. I hope we can do this again, because this has been absolutely wonderful, and you've given us so much here. And I hope you understand the significance of probably what you offered to a lot of people that will watch this in the middle portion of this talk, because there are a lot of people asking the questions that you alluded to and explicitly stated throughout. And this idea that we are always at work reconciling, like, that's part of what it means to be the church, to be those who participate in her. I can't overstate the importance of that for a lot of people. So thank you for that.
Well, I mean, thanks for having me. I realized that I didn't cover hardly any of your questions, so I'm so sorry.
No,
that was part of the strategy. So now you have to come back and do those other questions.
Right. Well, I'm happy to, because I actually gave quite a lot of thought to those other questions.
All right, we'll do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a part of expectations for Quandstrom Chair. That'll be easy to do.
That's
there
good.
you are. Perfect.
I love it.
That's one of the questions for Monday.
Okay.
I love it.
Oh, that's lovely.
For those of you watching, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have been blessed by this rich conversation. I can't thank you, Dr. Deirdre Latz, for enough for this. And Dr. Quandstrom, thank you so much for your conversation here in the midst of all that we've been talking about. Please stay tuned for more that is to come through the Center for Theological Leadership next month. Again, that is Tara Beth Leach and Scott McKnight. But then we are building out as we move towards the fall, and really excited about leveraging these kinds of platforms for meaningful dialogue, for equipping and inspiring our practitioners who are doing the work of ministry in a very complex environment, to live faithfully this Jesus way as you bear witness to the kingdom of God. And we trust that the Lord will bless and keep you as you go. And again, thank you so much. And what a gift today has been. God bless you all.